Welcome in to the Rock Talk Studio, the podcast that answers the question, is this rock and roll book or documentary worth your time and money? And today, the spotlight falls on the book Under a Rock by Stein of Blondie. This is his memoir, which I'll review, rate, and determine if this book is for you. And then, as always, I'll leave you with all the book buzz and documentary news you don't want to miss. I'm your host, Big Rick. Join me for an exclusive look into what's hitting the shelves and the screens, and get ready to rock your reading and viewing list. Even before launching Blondie with Debbie Harry, Stein's life was full of story, and he lays it out without a ton of frill in his memoir Under a Rock. His dad died when he was in high school, and at 14 years old, he started wandering the streets of New York, and this was in the late 60s. And he became fascinated by the scenes. And this is a theme that runs pretty much all the way through the book and became a big part of who he was and how he lived his life. And at the time when he was hanging around McDougal Street in New York in the 60s, the scene was very bohemian, and he fell into the hippie vibe that was in the West Village. And like every good hippie on the East Coast, he did the head west thing and ended up in Haight-Ashbury. He also ended up taking a bunch of drugs. Not unusual for that time, but unfortunately for him, he took so much LSD that he wound up in a psychiatric hospital at the age of 17. Crazy story. And this book is filled with him. What is interesting, other than the wild stories, is the way that Stein tells a story. This is what is the major strength, and I would consider weakness of this book. It's his delivery. It's kind of nonchalant. He doesn't come off ruffled by much. He can talk about overdoses, seedy characters, being robbed multiple times, living in squalor, hard life stuff without much of a flinch. These stories are full of a ton of names he throws around very casually. And when I say that, it's in no way an ego thing with Stein. He was just dropping names. I can't stress enough his kind of shrug it off way. And I don't know him, but it seems like this is who he really is. Even in Blondie, while his girlfriend, Debbie Harry, was getting massive attention, not only for her talent, but her looks, it didn't really seem to faze him that much. Names like Bowie, Iggy Pop, the artist Basquiat, the Ramones, Andy Warhol, they pop up a ton in this book. But you also have managers, agents, scenesters. I realized pretty on that I didn't need to know everyone he was talking about. I just needed to enjoy the ride. The Blondie years are his creative peak and what he is known for, and takes up a good chunk of the book. His recall of that time is shadowed by his crazy heroin addiction. He also has some pretty challenging health issues that plagued his life. This, combined with Stein's laid-back approach, doesn't deliver a ton of details about the music, and he admits that those times on drugs were ugly and led to him becoming broke after all these album sales. The book is full of gritty, dark street tales mixed with Stein's endless creativity. The guy is super creative. You bounce around from press junkets to sleazy New York apartments to come-and-go characters with strange names and strange habits to stages, huge stages all over the world. It's a whirlwind of creativity mixed with wild adventures and a life lived for the most part of the story on the fringe. I learned a ton about his life outside of Blondie, which is really intriguing and full of other projects, soundtrack work, photography, which he has become very well recognized for, art installations, art, his interest in magic, theater, and then, of course, music. Stein was streetwise and thrived on living in New York in the seedier parts of town. He just had this way of taking things in stride. You've got multiple band dysfunctions and breakups, muggings, even a kidnapping, and a lot of drug-fueled craziness are what make up this book and his fascinating life as an artist. Okay, now it's time to stamp the official Rock Talk Studio rating on Under a Rock. Let's see where this book stacks up against other titles I reviewed coming up next. Rock Talk Studio rating time. Let's rate the book Under a Rock by Stein. I do a rating system of 1 through 4. 1 is the best. It's front row center. It's a unique book that really sets itself apart from other ones. It's a one of a kind that will go down as a classic. That's a front row center. 2 is a floor seat that is highly recommended with a ton of reasons why. It's a don't miss read. 3 is a load seat, and that's okay. There are things I enjoyed about it. There are things I found lacking. A recommendation might lie in the type of fan you are about the subject. That's 3, a load seat. And 4 is where you don't want to be. That's a nosebleed, baby. Let's take a look at Under a Rock, and I give Under a Rock a 3, a load seat. To really enjoy this book, I think it helps to be into the New York scene and into what was going on in the 70s and 80s, to really have an interest there, because you really get a large serving of what was happening at that time, especially a lot of CBGB stories. The Blondie stuff, because of the way Stein presents it and remembers it, he talks in the book a lot about those stories are seen through drug-filled days. They lack a little bit of depth. That's the one thing I didn't get from this book, and the reason why I rated this a load seat. Though I did like a lot of the book. Stein was right there in the middle of it all and has lived a fascinating life. His retelling of it just lacked a little depth. There's a part in the book where he was struggling financially after selling, millions of records, writing iconic tunes, being in this band that was a pioneer of new age sound, and he just broke up with Debbie Harry, a real low point. And he mentioned, I was upset for a week or two. Maybe you want more details, but there aren't many. Maybe I'm wrong. It just feels like there is more to the story, because Stein lived through these incredible early New York City times. He grew up there and lived his whole life there. I got to say, I'm just greedy. I wanted more, which I guess is a good thing in some ways, a memoir, which leaves you wanting more. And that wraps up my review of the Chris Stein memoir, Under a Rock. The book is 267 pages, and it features a foreword by Debbie Harry. News about John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Eric Clapton, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Melissa Etheridge, all that is coming up after the break. I was looking at some of my stats the other day about the podcast, and 64% of the people who listen to the show listen to it through Apple Podcast. And this is where I'm going to ask for a little help. I'm going to ask you to please leave a review of the Rock Talk Studio podcast. I need help with this. And the reason why I need some help with this is more 5-star ratings mean a better ranking for the podcast and give new listeners confidence that they have stumbled on something that a lot of people enjoy. I'm on a quest to get 25 5-star ratings. Currently, I've got 14, and thanks to Jessica and Ben, who have left a 5-star review this week, I appreciate it. It just takes a few seconds, but means so much to me in the podcast. If you can help me get to 25 5-star reviews, that would be awesome. Speaking of awesome, I want to pay these good vibes forward and recommend a great podcast, a podcast that I've been listening to ever since I really started listening to podcasts, and kind of inspired me to take a look at start doing something in the rock and roll world. And that is a podcast called My Weekly Mixtape. The host, Brian, does a great show. It's a playlist curation podcast. Really interesting concept, very entertaining, and well done. Here's a few words from Brian about the show.
What does the word mixtape mean to you?
It was an art form.
Trying to woo them with my fantastic and eclectic taste in music.
If somebody gave you a mixtape, you felt like you really meant something to that person.
Mixtape to me is love.
My Weekly Mixtape is a podcast that takes the classic mixtape approach to building a modern playlist. I'm your host, Brian Colburn. Tune in to hear themed playlist curations.
No one in the history of anyone should ever put Pantera after Derek and the Dominoes, but here we are.
This is going to be the weirdest playlist ever created, and I love it.
One-on-one sit-downs with the artists that made our mixtape special in the first place.
It's Bill Gibson with Huey Lewis in the News.
I'm Art from the band Everclear.
This is Kenny Wayne Shepherd.
This is Frank Turner. And good Lord, you've made the right choice today.
And so much more. My Weekly Mixtape is a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Listen now at myweeklymixtape.com or by searching My Weekly Mixtape wherever you listen to podcasts.
Check out the My Weekly Mixtape podcast and leave Brian a 5-star review. He definitely deserves it. Coming up next, it's all that book buzz and documentary news. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about all those new things. Let's get you caught up on the books and the documentaries you don't want to miss out on. All the new projects just announced and released. Going to start with John and Yoko, 1 to 1. It's a new documentary that's coming out, and it's going to focus on the life of John and Yoko in New York City during the year of 1972, which is kind of a turbulent year for them. The movie, which was made with the cooperation of Lennon's estate, was directed by the Oscar-winning filmmaker Kevin MacDonald. The documentary centerpiece is Lennon's one-to-one concerts, which were at Madison Square Garden in August 30th, 1972. There were 2 shows that they filmed. It was right after the breakup of the Beatles, and John was accompanied by Yoko and the Plastic Ono Band. So this new documentary, John and Yoko One-to-One, is set to come out. The documentary features fully restored footage of the shows, remixed audio that were produced by Sean Lennon. The film also boasts previously unseen videos and unheard audio from Lennon's archives. The material includes phone calls, home movies recorded by Lennon and Ono themselves. There's a lot of Lennon stuff this year. It's crazy. Mind Games, the book, is coming out in September. You had May Pang's documentary, The Lost Weekend, which I thought was really good. You can check into the archives of the show if you want to hear the full review on May Pang's documentary. The recent reissues of the Let It Be film, of course. There's a great Yoko Ono book I'm reading right now that came out called In Your Mind. I'm going to be doing a show on that. And then there's the new doc, Revival 69, which is heavy on Lennon. It features a live performance that kind of convinced him that he needed to break away from the Beatles. Good time to be a Lennon fan. And speaking of that documentary, Revival 69, I just watched it last week. Interesting lineup concert, kind of old school versus new school back then. You've got Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Gene Vincent, and then you had Alice Cooper, The Doors, and John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band with Clapton sitting in on guitar. I'm going to be reviewing that one in next week's doc, so tune in for that, Revival 69. Getting back to another new project, and this one is about Melissa Etheridge, and it's called I'm Not Broken. It's a docuseries, and it focuses on the bonds that Melissa formed with incarcerated women over addiction issues that have affected their lives. And this just actually came out on Paramount Plus. Etheridge recently lost her son to an opioid overdose, and the 2-part series will follow her as she writes a new song inspired by her communications with 5 women that were locked up in this prison in Kansas. The anthem she writes for them is inspired by the letters that were coming to her from the prisoners discussing their issues with substance abuse, among other things that brought them there. And it's a topic that Etheridge is fully engaged on, especially because of the loss of her son. This is a new 2-part series out now. Melissa Etheridge, I'm Not Broken. Thanks for tuning in. Love talking rock and roll and getting a chance to recommend a few titles for you. I hope you found a few things that you might be interested in checking out. Just because the episode is over does not mean the conversation is. You can join me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube for more book and doc talk. All right, tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road. I'll see you next time in the Rock Talk studio.